So I heard a story about a guy that was walking along one day and he fell into a pit and he could not get out of the pit. He was stuck. And as he was stuck in this pit crying out for help, a religious person walked up and saw the man in the pit and looked at the man and said, "Only people who do bad things end up in pits." And he walked on. A little bit later, an educator walked up and heard the man crying from the pit. And the educator looked at the man and said, "You know what? If you had learned more, you wouldn't be in a pit." And he walked on. Just a little bit later, a reporter came by and he saw the man in the pit, and the reporter looked at him and said, "I would really like to write a story about your pit." And then he left him. It was a little bit later that a Democrat walked by. And the Democrat looked at him and said, "You know what? We're going to start a program to help people avoid pits." And a little bit later, a Republican came by. The Republican saw the man in the pit and said, "You know what? We're going to elect someone who's going to make America great again. There'll be no pits." Just a little bit later, a psychologist came by, and a psychologist looked at the guy and said, "You know what? It's your parents' fault that you're in this pit." A little bit later, someone who uses marijuana legally came by and saw the man in the pit and tossed him some marijuana and said, "Here, use this. The pit won't feel so bad." After that, there was a man that came by. It was a self-esteem influencer. The self-esteem influencer looked at him and said, "You know what? If you would just believe in yourself more, you could get out of the pit." A little bit later, an optimist came by. The optimist looked at him and said, "Don't worry, the pit's really not that bad." And a little bit later, a pessimist came by and said, "Oh, it's going to get worse." Finally, Jesus came by and pulled the man out of the pit. I tell that story to start our time off together this morning by simply saying that all of us get stuck in pits at different times in life. And we're surrounded by all kinds of words that people say that really don't help us get out of the pit. They're just words. You guys have heard the analogy, the saying, that actions speak louder than words. And in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is a man of few words, but there's a lot of action to what he does. And we're going to look at some of his actions this morning of how he can help people who are in different kinds of pits. Maybe even some of you find yourself in a pit this morning. Maybe someone watching online finds themselves in a pit this morning. And there's all kinds of words coming from all kinds of sources telling them this is how you get out of your pit. But no one actually helps them get out of their pit. And Jesus is just not like that. In this passage that we're going to look at today, I want us to think about what Jesus did for these people. And what he did for them is the exact same thing that he can do for you and I if we'll turn to him and if we'll let him. In Mark chapter 1, that's where we're going to be, beginning in verse 16. The first thing that I would like for us to notice is that Jesus calls and gives purpose to people. Sometimes the pit that people fall into is the pit of not knowing what it is exactly they're supposed to be doing with life. They've tried some things, and it's not fulfilling. It's not satisfying. It's not enough. And they're really wondering, what is my life about? What is it about? What am I supposed to be doing? In Mark chapter 1, verse 16, look at what Jesus did with some individuals. It says, as Jesus walked beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew. Now, you and I need to know, for those of us that have been in church a long time, Simon eventually is called Peter. Okay, this is the apostle, the disciple Peter. If you're not familiar with the scriptures, you wouldn't know that later his name changes. But this is the Simon that we're talking about, the Simon that became Peter, who eventually followed and became a disciple of Jesus. That's what this is about. It says, Jesus walked beside the Sea of Galilee. He saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. "Come, follow me," Jesus said, "and I will send you out to fish for people." At once they left their nets and followed him. And when he had gone a little farther, he saw James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John in a boat preparing their nets. And without delay, he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired men and followed him. I want us to think a little bit about this morning what's going on in this part of the passage that we're going to look at. The idea that Jesus calls people to a purpose. He calls them to a meaning in their life, something that he wants them to do. And for these four guys, they were all fishermen, and Jesus walked up to them and said, "Come, follow me, and I'll make you fishers of men, fishers of people." Now, what you and I need to know, some cultural things that are going on that we may not be aware of, and some scriptural things. First of all, if we go to the other Gospels, Matthew, Luke, and John, we will discover that when this happened, when Jesus showed up to these four men and called them to come follow him, these four men had already met Jesus. In fact, they already believed that he was the Messiah. And so Jesus shows up and he says, "Come, follow me." So this is not their first encounter with Jesus. They've heard him speak. They've heard him teach. They've seen him do some miracles. They already believe in him, okay? And so we kind of need to keep that in mind. What's really interesting that's going on here, that in Jesus' time, rabbis, which is what Jesus was considered to be, a rabbi, rabbis did not go and recruit people to be their disciples, okay? What would happen is if someone heard a rabbi and they wanted to learn from that rabbi, the way we would say it is they applied to learn from the rabbi. Jesus did it totally different. Jesus didn't take applications. He calls people to himself. He would go to the people, and especially these that became his disciples, and he would say, "I want you to follow me. Will you come follow me?" And this phrase, "come follow me," literally it means stay behind me. That's what Jesus was telling these four men. Will you come and stay behind me? Will you follow me, learn from me, be like me, strive to do what I do? That's what he was asking these guys to do. Jesus, see, because they already believed, Jesus was calling them to do something more than believe. And that's what, if you want to get out of a pit, all right, believing in Jesus is not enough to get out of a pit. Jesus calls us to do something more than believe, and that is to actually get behind him. Be like him. See the world like he sees the world. See people like he sees people. Treat people like he treats people. That's how Jesus pulls us out of a pit of what am I supposed to do with my life? And that's what Jesus was doing with these four men, calling them to be like him. Now, for this to happen, for you and I to get behind Jesus, we have to let go of some things. And these four men, they let go of their plan for their life. Now, for them, it was a career change. And I want you to know that to follow Jesus, to get behind Jesus, doesn't always involve a career change. But it does involve laying down our personal agendas and what we're trying to do with our life. And reaching that place where we say, you know what, I'm going to get behind Jesus. It doesn't mean I have to change careers, but it changes why I'm in this career, why I'm doing what I'm doing. because now I'm following Jesus in this career. Does that make sense? Now, sometimes he calls us out of different careers. There are people sitting in this room right now that they've encountered that following Jesus for them meant that they needed to change careers. But that's not how it works for everybody. Sometimes he's just calling us to do our career for a different reason, to do it for him. The other thing that's going on in this passage with Simon and Andrew, or Peter and Andrew, it was calling them away from their career. But when it came to James and John, the Bible explicitly says they were with their father when Jesus called them. And they laid their nets down and they left their father. And that kind of speaks to the expectations that sometimes our family has on us. And to follow Jesus, to get behind him, means that many times we can't do exactly what our family might wish we would do. I can't help but wonder what Zebedee must have thought when James and John, I mean, they're the apparent heirs of the business, when they gave that up to follow Jesus. And I can tell you that one of the strangest things or hardest things to watch sometimes is when a student feels like God is moved in their life and is calling, and then for them to get behind Jesus, they have to break away from the expectations that their parents have of what their life should be like. But sometimes that can happen as adults, that can not just happen as students, but to get behind Jesus, we have to walk away from the expectations that others have on us to get behind him and to follow him. Jesus is still calling people into this life of following him. Listen, here's the thing that happens. I don't want to spend too much more time on this because we've got other things to talk about. But folks, I just want you to know something. The vast majority of people who believe in Jesus are not behind Jesus. They're not behind him. They believe in him, but they're not behind him. That's true for some of you sitting in this room right now. You believe in him, but you're not behind him, not yet. That's true for many of you watching online. You believe in him, but you're not behind him. And until we get behind him, he cannot pull us out of that pit of what am I doing with my life? Where is it going? That's how Jesus rescues us from that pit. There's another pit that Jesus rescues us from that we're going to see in this next part of this passage, and that is that Jesus teaches truth that confronts fruitless attitudes. Fruitless attitudes. I really wrestled on how to communicate that this morning because there's a lot of fruitless attitudes in our lives. And when we begin to listen to what he has to say to us, when we begin to read the word and understand what he's communicating, he calls people, he confronts these fruitless attitudes that become so much a part of our lives. Look at what happens in this passage. Jesus takes these four men, and it says they went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, Jesus went into the synagogue and began to teach. Now, the Sabbath is the Jewish form of our Sunday, so to speak, and it was a day of worship. And when they went to synagogue, a synagogue was a place. It could have been an actual building, or it could just be a place where people met. But typically, for a place to be considered a synagogue, there had to be at least 10 Jewish males aged 13 or older there, okay? That's what constituted a place of worship where people would gather. And what would happen is that they would take the Old Testament and they would read a passage of the Old Testament. They would meditate, talk about that. And it wasn't uncommon for traveling rabbis to show up at a particular synagogue and that rabbi would be the guest speaker that day. Well, that's what's happening here. Jesus is this traveling rabbi. He shows up to the synagogue at this synagogue at Capernaum, and he's going to be their guest speaker that day. And so while he's there and he begins to speak, it says the people were amazed. Okay? So that word amazed means they were struck with shock and awe. It's what is not happening right now. That's a joke. Wake up. Some of you wake up, all right? When Jesus spoke, people were in awe. When I speak, not so much. Okay? All right? But that's what made Jesus stand out. When he spoke, he was speaking in such a way like no one has ever said things like this before. No one has made the scriptures come alive like he makes them come alive. No one has ever been able to speak into me what he is speaking into me. And they were in awe. It was like this emotional response. If you could imagine, when we're emotionally engaged, we show that different ways. Sometimes people cry. Sometimes people smile. Sometimes they're just like in awe of what's going on. That's what was happening in this room. And while that was taking place, notice what happened. They were amazed at his teaching because he taught them as one who had authority, not as the teachers of the law. Just then, a man in their synagogue who was possessed by an impure spirit cried out, "What do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." "Be quiet," said Jesus sternly. "Come out of him." And the impure spirit shook the man violently and came out of him with a shriek. And the people were also amazed. Yeah, they were. They were already amazed to begin with. And then all of a sudden, this person confronts Jesus. And it's this impure spirit. Well, the people were also amazed that they asked each other, "What is this? A new teaching, and with authority. He even gives orders to impure spirits, and they obey him." Now, every time I read this passage, the very first thing that I think of is, how long has this man been in their synagogue? How long has he been coming and participating in their worship activities? And if he's been there a long time, obviously they didn't know this guy had an impure spirit, right? If they had known he had an impure spirit, they'd try to do something. I don't know what. Probably wouldn't have worked, but they'd have tried to do something to try to deal with that. This guy acted just like them. And it wasn't until Jesus showed up that anyone knew something was off. Okay? So that's what's going on in this passage. This word possessed, it's kind of a mystical word for us. We wonder, what does that mean for someone to be possessed by a spirit? The word literally means under the influence. Okay, that's what the word possessed means. It's under the influence. It means that someone's reasoning has been dethroned. They're not thinking like they could think because they're under the influence of something else. That's what the word means. In the New Testament, scriptures, they never teach that a person can be permanently possessed. So I know in the movies and Hollywood and things like that Hollywood movies seem to depict that someone could be possessed by a spirit and it's a permanent possession. Well, the Bible simply doesn't teach that. The Bible teaches that people have moments where they're being influenced. Their reasoning has been dethroned, and they're under the influence of something that's not good. Okay? So when the Bible talks about possession in the New Testament, that's what it's talking about. All right? And that's what's going on in this passage. This man, he cries out, "What do you want to do with us?" Now, when he refers to the us, he's not talking about everyone in synagogue. He's talking about the man that is under the influence. In other words, he's saying, me and this man, why are you meddling with us? Why don't you mind your own business? Me and this man, we agree about some things. That's what this spirit begins to cry out in confrontation to Jesus. It's like, why are you here messing with us? We were happy till you got here. We were doing just fine till you got here. Why are you messing with me and this man? That's what the spirit begins to cry out to Jesus. When we talk about this impure spirit, in this short passage, impure spirit, those two words are used 3 times in 5 verses. And the word impure, when we think of impure, Stephen and I were talking about this past week. When we think of impure, immediately we think of something sexual. That some kind of impure sexual behavior is taking place or thought is happening. But in this particular word right here, the word impure, it doesn't have anything to do with any type of sexual thoughts or behaviors. This word impure, it means improper thinking about truth. Okay? So let me give you a picture of what it would look like. Imagine that you're looking at a fruit tree, an apple tree. Say there's an apple tree. You're looking at this apple tree, and every branch on the apple tree is producing fruits except one branch. That branch is dead. And it's still a part of the tree, but it's fruitless. It's not producing any fruit. That's what this impure spirit was doing to this guy. He's fruitless. There's nothing coming from his life. That's why it's impure. What would we do with a fruit tree in our yard with a branch on one tree that is not producing fruit? Well, we would go and we would cut that branch off, because whatever's wrong with that branch, we don't want it to move through the organism of the tree. Well, that's kind of what's happening right here. This guy he has these thoughts, these attitudes inside of him that has made him fruitless. Listen, he's religious, but he's fruitless. That ought to say something to us. Here's a guy who's religious. He as far as his peers are concerned, he seems normal. He seems like one of them. He seems like this is a good guy to be at our worship service. But when Jesus shows up and begins to preach the truth, now then this fruitless attitude inside of him is being exposed. It's being called out. I think there's a warning here for us. A couple of warnings. First, and that is that impure spirits can influence religious people. I don't doubt whatsoever that there's some really good people sitting right here in this room right now, really good people watching online, really good people in churches all across America. They are good, religious people, but they have fruitless attitudes. There's no fruit coming from their life. And Jesus confronts that. And he pulls people out of that pit. He brings them from that. He confronts this impure spirit, and then he silences it. We're going to come back and talk about this in a minute, but what this demon actually, this impure spirit, what it actually says about Jesus is absolutely accurate, which is scary in itself too. This impure spirit says, you are the Son of God. I know who you are, the Holy One, the Son of God. Absolutely right. But Jesus silences him. The Bible says that the man shook violently. It's what it feels like sometimes when Jesus confronts the fruitless attitudes that we have in our life. It's kind of a violent shakeup. Because I was under the influence of something that was so wrong. And I didn't recognize it. My peers didn't recognize it. My family didn't recognize it. But it was not until Jesus spoke to me that I realized my life is not what it should be. And Jesus called that out. And it messed with this man. It shook him. And it shakes us when it happens to us. And he called it out. And listen, when he called this out of this man, this spirit does not come out at the expense of the victim. Okay, in other words, the man is not hurt by this. He was shook violently, but he wasn't scarred by it. He was freed by it. And that's what Jesus doesn't scar us. He frees us from these impure, fruitless attitudes that are so common among the religious. And then this man who was broken is restored. And he's pulled out of the pit. And Jesus still does that. He still does it. Not only does Jesus do this for people, we can see in this next part of the passage that Jesus restores people so they can become contributors. Look at what happens. All this happens in one day. Can you imagine walking with Jesus in one day? I mean, imagine these poor 4 guys who just walked away from their nets and the first thing they do is let's go to church. That seems normal. But while at church, holy cow, never seen anything like that before. Well, they leave that. They leave the synagogue, and this is what happens next. Jesus restores people so they can become contributors. So what happens is, the Bible tells us that news about him spread quickly over the whole region of Galilee. They didn't have social media to help them with that. It was word of mouth. People were hearing. Whatever happened in that synagogue, that began to spread really quickly. As soon as they left the synagogue, they went with James and John to the home of Simon and Andrew. So this is Peter's house, Peter and Andrew's house. And Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever. And they immediately told Jesus about her, so he went to her, he took her by the hand and helped her. The fever left her, and she began to wait on them. I find this really interesting. Okay, first of all, it tells us that Peter, his mother-in-law was sick. After synagogue, okay, it's kind of like after we get through meeting here today, we're going to go our separate ways. Everybody's going to go home. Well, that's what they did that day. They just went home. They went to Peter's house after synagogue was over with, and when they got there, Peter's mother-in-law, she's not feeling well. She's got a fever. And they tell Jesus about it. Now, you and I, we can kind of understand fever, right? I mean, people today get a fever, and sometimes, they can be out for 3 or 4 days because it takes them that long to recover from it just saps them. Well, that's what's happening to Peter's mother-in-law. And Jesus comes and he helps her, and the fever leaves her, and immediately she gets up and she starts serving Jesus and the people that are there. Jesus heals her, and immediately she becomes a contributor to what's going on immediately around her. Folks, there's three attitudes. Here's what's troubling inside of myself, inside of the church, inside many of us, is that many of us, even here in this room right now, would stand up and say, Jesus has touched me. More than just physically, spiritually, Jesus has touched me. He has made me a whole person. But the problem is that there's no contribution then from that person. They claim something, but there's no contribution from their life to serving Jesus and serving those around them. We find in this passage, immediately as she is healed, immediately she begins to contribute. And there's these attitudes that reside inside of us. There's this attitude of some people, hopefully no one here in the room, but we can't be above it. We can't be above it, those watching online, is this attitude that says, what's yours is mine and I'm going to take it. That attitude exists. That attitude exists among people that they've got something, I want it, I'm going to take it. Hopefully that's not your attitude. The most prevalent attitude that I see in the church in America today is this attitude. What's mine is mine and I'm going to keep it. It would be like Peter's mother-in-law getting her health back immediately and jumping up and saying, I'm headed to the lake. Boy, I feel better. I'm going to do something fun, something for myself. I feel good now. I'm going to go gather up with some people and have a picnic somewhere. That attitude is prevalent inside the church. What's mine is mine. I'm going to keep it. I'm going to keep it. I'm not going to share. Jesus has made me feel better. Jesus has given me purpose. Jesus puts a smile on my face, and you know what? I'm going to keep it all to myself. I have a good time with my life. What's mine is mine. And I'm going to keep it. But there's a third attitude. The one that Jesus calls us to, that we see from Peter's mother-in-law. And it's this attitude of, what's mine is yours, and I'm going to give it. And that's what she does. Oh, my health is for your benefit. I'm going to serve Jesus. And I want to serve those around me. He's helped me. He's helped me. I now have something to give. I was in a pit, and I couldn't give. I got pulled out of the pit. Instead of running off and having a good old time all by myself so I could enjoy being out of the pit, no, I've been pulled out of the pit so that I can help others and serve others. Simple, isn't it? So hard to do. Because we live in a society that promotes what's mine is mine, and it's for me. Even when Jesus touches me, even when Jesus makes my life better, even when Jesus gives me the miracle, it's for me. Jesus gives me the raise, it's for me. Jesus lets me have the accomplishment, it's for me. Jesus lets me have the good day, it's for me. It's all for me because it's all about me. Folks, proof of truly being touched by Jesus is when we become a contributor. When we realize that the blessings that come our way are not just for us. It is so that we can contribute to those around us. And Jesus pulls people from that pit. He'll pull you from that pit. The last thing that happened in the day, there's just one day, just this one day in Jesus' life, is that Jesus has compassion and the power to help those who come to him. Look at what the Bible says. It says that evening, it was a Sabbath. Now remember, we're going to come back and talk about that. It was a Sabbath day. After sunset, the people brought to Jesus all the sick and demon-possessed. Why did they wait till sunset? Well, because it was Sabbath. And there was a lot of social norms and religious rules in place. Actually, people were afraid. The rules were that you could only walk a certain distance on a Sabbath day. And if you walked beyond that distance, you were breaking Sabbath rules. You get in trouble with the powers that be because you walked farther than you were supposed to walk, even though you were just walking to get some help. So the minute the sun went down, 6 p.m., people started moving to Jesus. Imagine that. Imagine that in your mind. And it says the whole town gathered at the door, and Jesus healed many who had various diseases. He also drove out many demons, but he would not let the demons speak. All right? There it is. Second time in this passage we find Jesus not letting demons speak because they knew who he was. That makes it sound strange. That makes it sound like Jesus had something to hide, doesn't it? Oh, these demons are speaking about Jesus, but he won't let them speak because they really know who he is. But that's not what was going on. So imagine, if you will, all these people that are afraid to break social norms, even though they want Jesus' help, they're afraid to approach Jesus until it's, okay, it's acceptable, now I can go. And they flock to Peter's house. Imagine the people gathering under the stars that night, because it was dark. This wasn't during the day, it was at night. And imagine all these people coming to Peter's house, and it's dark, and they're gathered out in just around where Peter lives. And Jesus, he goes out, imagine, he goes out and he begins to have compassion for these people. He's had a pretty long day. Look, Sunday at 6 o'clock, don't call me. It's been a long day. Not so with Jesus. He's out there in the night. Who knows how long that lasted? Touching people, talking to people, having compassion on them. When Jesus told the demons that they couldn't speak, why wouldn't he let them speak? I think it's pretty simple. Because Jesus didn't want demons representing him, even though they were saying the truth. They didn't want him. He didn't want them representing him. That would cause confusion, wouldn't it? That a demon knows all this stuff about Jesus, so he silenced them. When it comes to this thing of compassion, and the compassion that Jesus had, I get it. Not only does he have compassion, he has the power to help people. You and I, we can have compassion, but we don't always feel like we have the power to help. And by ourselves, we don't. With Jesus, even the compassion that we share with him working in us and through us, our compassion can make a difference in people's lives. I read a story about a pastor that was called to pastor a church in an urban city, and there was a lot of poverty and crime around his church, and he was standing in his office one day, and his office was in a building, and so he was overlooking the neighborhoods that he had been called to be their pastor, and he was crying, he was weeping, and one of his other staff members who had been there a while walked in and said, "What's wrong?" He said, I'm just looking at the neighborhoods we've been called to and all the people and they're hurting and their needs. And the guy said, "Oh yeah, I know." He said, "After you've been here a while, that'll go away." And the pastor looked at him and he said, "Yeah, I know. That's why I'm crying." compassion. And that's what happens to us. There's a lot of needs in the world, right? We see a lot of bad things happening on the news, but it's not just the news. We see it in our neighbors. We see it in our coworkers. If you go to school, you see it with other students and their families. And we see all these things around us that are bad, that are going on in the world. And a lot of us have just got desensitized. We don't cry anymore. We've lost our compassion for the people that are hurting. Jesus can pull us out of that pit. He can make us compassionate again where we care. And our compassion, here's the thing. We don't like being compassionate because it costs us something. It's kind of a downer. First of all, it costs us our emotions, doesn't it? We can be all happy and see someone without and have compassion, and all of a sudden that kind of robs us of our happiness because we see what's going on with them. But then if we're truly going to be compassionate and help someone, we invest in them and somehow. That costs time, and time is precious, isn't it? We don't like to use time much beyond for how we want to use it, and so we get stuck in that pit. And we lose our ability to be compassionate. Some of us need to be pulled out of that pit. Some of you sitting right here, some of you watching online. You're busy, you're good, but you're not compassionate. And you won't allow yourself to be compassionate. That's a pit that Jesus can pull us out of. If you're watching online this morning, our time together is done. Thank you for being a part of this service, and I pray that you'll do as God leads you to do.